Good morning, and thank you for joining me on the path to liberty. I'm Michael Bolden with the 10th Amendment Center, and this is the Fast Friday edition of the show for November 17th, 2023. And as we get ready to kick off nullification season of 2024, I wanted to share with you a big picture overview of the top 4 federal programs that I see absolutely have to get nullified if we ever want to turn things around from where we are today, the largest government in history, to a real land of the free. But let's kick this off with a little strategy from Thomas Jefferson. Today in history, November 17th, 1798, the day after the resolutions that he drafted for Kentucky in response to the Alien and Sedition Acts, the day after they were signed, he fired off a letter to James Madison, who we know was working on similar resolutions for Virginia, and he said this: "I enclose you a copy of the draft of the Kentucky Resolves. I think we should distinctly affirm all the important principles they contain, so as to hold to that ground in the future, and leave the matter in such a train as that we may not be committed absolutely to push the matter to extremities, and yet may be free to push as far as events will render prudent." And yet may be free to push as far as events will render prudent. I think that really deserves a second take because it's so essential to Thomas Jefferson to do a 1-2 punch. That is, you have your ultimate principles, but you also recognize that you're not going to get from where you are today to where you want to be in one fell swoop. And some of the principles that he was talking about, what he's mentioning in regards to those Kentucky resolutions of 1798 include these. An act outside the Constitution is void, but it doesn't turn into void in practice on its own. And submitting to unconstitutional acts and waiting for the feds to tell us if the feds violated the Constitution is really what helps establish a system of unlimited power. So for Thomas Jefferson, a nullification of the act is the rightful remedy. It's not something to wait 2 or 4 or 6 years for, to try down the line or after everything else is tried and failed, but the rightful remedy whensoever, as he put it, the general government assumes undelegated powers. Now, at the same time, we have to also recognize, based on Jefferson's strategic advice, that nullifying major parts of the largest empire ever is going to take a lot of work. It's going to take a lot of patience and a lot of steps to get there. So putting that all into practice, here are my top 4 to nullify for 2024 to get us on a real path to liberty. Number 1 is the central bank, the Federal Reserve. The Fed is the engine that powers the biggest government in history, but it's not going to end itself. Here from Hunter Hastings, an old article over at the Mises Institute. Hunter's a friend. He does great work. He said, "This institutionally independent but politically directed central bank spearheads a process that enables largely unlimited government spending. It expands credit and enables fiat money, which is produced without practical limitation." Hunter goes on. He says, "Fiat money enables government to issue debt, which, at least so far, also has been pursued without restraint." So far, it keeps getting worse. "The unlimited government debt enables unrestrained growth in government spending. So as long as they can keep this cycle going, government will never, ever, ever slow down its pace of growth. It'll just keep getting worse and worse and worse." And Hunter goes on. He says, "Thus, the state is set free from having to collect tax revenue before it can spend. And as Mises explained in such a case, there is no limitation on government at all." I'm sorry for the long quotes here, but I thought this was really interesting. Here's how Mises put it. "The government has but one source of revenue, taxes. No taxation is legal without parliamentary consent. But if the government has other sources of income, it can free itself from this control." So by using inflation, the money printer, the Federal Reserve, it's able to generate more loot for itself, even though it causes everything to cost more for us. It's what Ron Paul and many others have referred to as an inflation tax. Some of the founders called it that as well. They recognize that depreciating of paper money acts as a tax, especially on the poor. Hear from Hunter. Without restraints on government spending, there are no restraints on government's mission or on the growth in the bureaucracy that administers the spending. The result is a continuous increase in regulations and a continuous expansion of state power. So again, number one is the central bank. That brings me to number two. Oh, actually, before we get to number two, I should point out that this doesn't even include all the dangers of a potential central bank digital currency that they want to shove down our throat. So the most important first step is what Mike Meharry says here. We need currency competition. That means finding sound money alternatives to federal government-produced and controlled fiat money. Now, I would actually say even non-sound money alternatives, as long as they're not government-controlled, are an improvement. Now, it may not be a smart choice for you economically, but no one should be dictating to you how you buy and sell. As long as you can come into an agreement of what medium of exchange you're going to use with someone who's selling you something, whether it's a product or a service or whatever it may be, that should be a private decision between those people. Anyways, Mike Meharry continues. This could come in the form of gold, silver, or non-government cryptocurrencies, such as Bitcoin. It could even involve ways of transacting business we haven't even thought of yet. But we need money that is not subject to Federal Reserve and government control and manipulation. And they're manipulating us through how they manipulate the fiat dollar. And Mike points out the really important thing here, especially when we're considering a CBDC, because so many people we're hearing are telling us, oh, I'm just going to hold on to my U.S. dollar. But the U.S. dollar is a tool of tyranny. It is the parent of a central bank digital currency, not something that you can use to defend against it. And Mike says this, supporting one form of government money over another is not a long-term solution, nor will it ever push the needle forward for the Constitution and liberty. So again, number one is we got to nullify the central bank. And one way to do that is just to choose to use money that is not central bank digital currency. It is not central bank or government fiat money. And one thing that I always like to recommend is the gold back. I've got this here. This will be linked to in the show notes. Alan Mosley, of course, organizes those for every episode, and that'll be published a couple hours after the live stream is done here today over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. The gold back, they say, is the world's first physical, interchangeable gold money that is designed to accommodate even small transactions. That's goldback.com. And this brings me to number two. Federal gun control needs to be nullified into oblivion. The number of federal gun control measures that are authorized under the Constitution is zero. That includes the National Firearms Act of 1934, the Gun Control Act of 1968, its amendments in 1986, the bump stock ban in 2018, of course, the Undetectable Firearms Act in 1988, and everything that they've passed or basically tried to shove down our throats in recent years, and anything that may come along in the future as well. Zero is the number of federal gun control measures that are authorized under the Constitution. St. George Tucker tells us the importance of the right to keep and bear arms, the right of self-defense. And that's why it's so high on my, and this is not in any particular order. Maybe it is. Maybe it would change around next time I do it. But St. George Tucker tells us why this is so important. In view of the Constitution of the United States, he said this may be considered as the true palladium of liberty. The right of self-defense is the first law of nature. In most governments, it has been the study of rulers to confine this right within the narrowest limits possible. Governments do not like it when the population can defend itself. That's a huge problem for them, because how can they ever completely oppress you if you can fight back? And of course, when you combine that with large, permanent standing armies, which the entire founding generation absolutely despised, even if they thought smaller ones were necessary from time to time, they did not like military establishments like we have today. And Tucker continued. He said, wherever standing armies are kept up, and when the right of the people to keep and bear arms is, under any color or pretext whatsoever, prohibited, liberty, if not already annihilated, is on the brink of destruction. And if liberty has not already been annihilated today, it certainly is on the brink of destruction, despite the fact that we're still able to exercise some rights. But really, we're in a state of luck because government claims the power to shut down whatever they want under some kind of imaginary emergency clause in the Constitution, which I guess I could cover in another episode. Now, people need to learn how to exercise their rights, and this is probably the most important part, the most important essential step to nullify federal gun control is that people need to learn how to exercise their rights, whether the government wants them to or not, whether government gives them a permission slip or not, whether the federal courts tell them they can or not. Liberty is about being free, whether the government approves of it or not. And that's how Thomas Jefferson put it as well. He said, a free people claim their rights as derived from the laws of nature and not as a gift of their chief magistrate. And I covered 4 essential steps to nullify federal gun control in an episode early in 2022 that'll be linked to in the show notes. And there we also learned that, well, maybe not in that one. I can't remember, actually, now that I'm thinking about it. But certainly in our work, the top opponents of these efforts to nullify federal gun control always come from police lobbying groups. You'd think it would be the gun grabber groups, the traditional ones, but it's really law enforcement lobbying groups. And that brings me to point number 3, which is we have to nullify the ever-increasing national police state. Everything from mass warrantless surveillance to civil asset forfeiture and prohibition, not just on your natural right of self-defense, but prohibition on what plants you can grow in your own backyard and consume in your own home. We have to get rid of the police state today before it gets rid of whatever is left of our liberty. Now, state and local law enforcement are getting increasingly blended into one giant blob. It should be state and local on its own, state, local, and then federal, but they're all getting combined into this one thing, an unholy alliance that makes up this unconstitutional national police state. And there are plenty of areas where states and localities and sometimes even individuals can just straight up opt out of the system and help bring it to an end. I covered it in some detail also in another episode just last month, Nullify the National Police State, Top 5 to opt out. And I'm talking about things like, again, mass warrantless surveillance. This happens on a national level, a federal level. It also happens on a state and a local level in many ways. And they're always tied in together because, of course, the federal government has all kinds of grant programs to basically bring local law enforcement under their umbrella. So if they give them all this money, billions and billions of dollars being thrown out there, then of course they'll use the equipment and cash that they're being handed to do stuff and share information that they're collecting without a warrant with the feds through information sharing environment, fusion centers, and the like. So then we also have the Federal Equitable Sharing Civil Asset Forfeiture Program, which was really spearheaded back in 1984, an appropriate year, from a certain senator from Delaware. We have to withdraw from these partnerships with the feds, these joint task forces and their federal grant programs. And we have to opt out of the grant programs that basically militarize the local police and give the money doesn't come NSA, and I don't mean surveillance, it's no strings attached. When they throw out that money, they're expecting something in return. So they also have to get out of the prohibition business. For states, that means stop helping the feds in the enforcement of prohibition. And that means prohibition on your natural right of self-defense, restrictions, and of course, the war on drugs. For individuals, again, it gets back to people learning how to do what they believe is their rights, exercise their rights, whether the government wants you to or not. And again, that was covered in this episode, Nullify the National Police State, Top 5 to opt out. And that brings me to point number 4. Top 4 to nullify. Number 4 is the empire. Last but definitely not least is this number 4, the empire. And Defend the Guard Act is a state-level act that is an essential first step against the largest empire in the history of the world. Here from James Madison, writing in Political Observations, April 20th, 1795, he put it this way. Of all the enemies to public liberty, war is perhaps the most to be dreaded because it comprises and develops the germ of every other. War is the parent of armies. From these proceed debts and taxes. And armies and debts and taxes are the known instruments for putting the many under the domination of the few. And we have an absolute trifecta. We've got tons of all of these. Madison warned us. This is the father of the Constitution telling us that this is the process. Now, here he is again. This was in April of 1795, but back in the Philadelphia Convention, he also warned against standing armies. This is August 23rd, 1787, but this also ties in with number 2, protecting and defending the natural right of self-defense and nullifying federal gun control. Madison put it this way: as the greatest danger to liberty is from large standing armies, it is best to prevent them by an effectual provision for a good militia. Now, we are nowhere even remotely close to dismantling and nullifying the empire, but we have to start taking a stand in order to get the ball rolling. And an essential first step is the Defend the Guard Act. Here from Mike Meharry, he said, this is a state-level bill that would stop the deployment of a state's National Guard units unless specific constitutional criteria are met. In other words, basically, well, you got to follow the Constitution, or you don't get to send the Guard all around the world to engage in active duty combat. And it would prohibit the deployment of state Guard troops in active duty combat unless Congress has passed a declaration of war or taken official action pursuant to Article 1, Section 8, Clause 15 of the Constitution to explicitly call forth the Guard for one of 3 enumerated purposes: execute the laws of the Union, suppress insurrections, and repel invasions. And I covered this legislation, which we originally drafted. It's gone through some support by various other people and improvements from people like Pat McGeehan and others, and bringourtroopshome.us, I believe, is their website, over the years. But I covered that in some detail in another episode last November. Defend the Guard, support the Constitution, resist the empire. Because as Madison told us, war is perhaps the most to be dreaded because it gives us so much more. The standing armies, which are the greatest threat to liberty, plus the debts and the taxes, which keep getting worse and worse and worse. Well, there you have it. That's my top 4 for 2024. I should point out that next week, Thanksgiving week, I hope you're going to have an awesome time with family, friends, or a combination. But I'm going to play my podcast episode kind of by ear. I'm not 100% sure if I'm going to be available. I'm just going to kind of see how it goes. If I have the time to be able to do 1 or 2 shows, I'm definitely going to do it. But it's possible that I'm just going to have the week off and try to catch up on a few things, work early in the week, and then some time with family and friends later in the week. But either way, whether I see you next week or the following week, I really appreciate you spending some time with me today. And if you want to help us get this kind of message out to more and more people, absolutely nothing helps us do this kind of work more than the financial faith and support of our members, especially at this time of year as we're trying to ramp up to nullification season 2024. Nothing is going to help us get more nullification legislation introduced and passed than your financial support. You can join us for as little as $2 a month over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. We also have annual, lifetime, and 5-year options. No pressure, but it would be awesome if you threw a couple of bucks of that dirty government fiat our way, especially if we're talking about nullifying the central bank as well. Again, I really appreciate you being here. That's 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. I really appreciate you being here. I hope you have an awesome weekend. I hope you have a great Thanksgiving, whether I get the chance to chat with you or see you next week or not. And I hope to see you next time here on the path to liberty.